Entrepreneurs, self-employed individuals, students, and employees seeking meaning or financial freedom, whether you are in the e-commerce or other sectors. Rich Dad, Poor Dad by Robert Kiyosaki, titled Rich Father, Poor Father, must have already been familiar to you regardless of your current situation. You may have just begun thinking about financial independence if you're hearing about it for the first time. Welcoming you to this new world. It is based on the differences in education between poor and rich families in the book Rich Father, Poor Father. Unfortunately, poor parents do not educate their children to become wealthy. The following are just a few numbers that always make people cringe. More than twice as much wealth is held by the richest 1% of the world's population. More than 4.6 billion people, or more than 60% of the world's population, are wealthier than the 2,153 billionaires in the world. The last shocking statistic for feminists is that men hold 50% more money globally than women. These numbers are from the most recent Oxfam France study, which was released just before the 2020 Davos meeting of top economic decision makers. The population's need for generalized financial education is Robert Kiyosaki's proposed remedy. Additionally, he offers many insightful insights in this book. Every month, a large number of people look for the lessons from this book. Wealthy Father Poor Review, or Rich Father Poor Summary online. We chose to serve it to you on a tray, but we highly suggest reading it. Question: but why is the book Rich Dad Poor Dad? Is Rich Dad Poor Dad so popular? That's because this book has the power to change your life. The reasons for Rich Dad Poor Dad's success. The book Courage Per Poverty, which was promoted as one of the best books for entrepreneurs poor upon its release, has been a bestseller for more than 20 years in several nations throughout the world. It outraged the media, the wealthy who had some of their secrets revealed, as well as the middle class, largely salaried employees who were considered to be the poor in this book. However, Rich Father, Poor Father is the book that has sold the most copies worldwide about personal finance. Why the sudden craze? Because the poor see the deceit of which they are victims rather soon after reading this book. The world is created for the affluent and run by the rich. And because they are confined to a daily schedule that includes taking the subway, going to work, sleeping, and paying off debt, the poor are forced to foot the tab for the rich. Rich versus poor. This cognitive dissonance between the rich and the poor is also discussed by Robert Kiyosaki in his book Dad Rich Dad Poor. The poor frequently hate the wealthy. Why do you pay such little tax while being so wealthy? Why isn't wealth spread more evenly? Why does the wealth gap keep becoming wider? Where did we come from? The hatred of the wealthy has been brought to my attention through my entourage, and I still hear it today. If so-and-so has a beautiful house, it's because his parents helped him who are armored. This person stinks of money. Politicians are all corrupted by money. It's easy for them because they had an inheritance. It's always the same people who pay. They don't want to pay their taxes, but they do shin. Finally, we hear it so frequently that we start to believe it. Even more so in a nation like America, and others discussing money is still frowned upon in both professional and private settings. Even if you don't like to read, Robert Kiyosaki wrote Poor Rich Father to make it accessible to everyone. By reading this book, you may also think that Robert repeats himself quite a bit, but it is a learning technique. Lesson 1: The rich don't work for money. The poor and middle class work for money. The rich have money work for them. Each lesson in Rich Dad Poor Dad starts with a major quotation from Robert. This chapter's central thesis is straightforward. You don't work for money. Money works for you. By sharing his first encounter with Rich Dad, who agrees to teach him how to become wealthy in exchange for Robert working for him on the weekends, Robert instills some important concepts in this lesson. Robert agrees and puts in a lot of effort for the meager pay. Robert returns to his wealthy father upset and prepared to resign after waiting for several weeks for him to either give him more money or fulfill his promise to teach him something. I work for nothing, I learn nothing, and I deserve better treatment. Rich Dad reacts by saying, "Not bad. In less than a month, you talk and think like most of my employees." Its employees work for money and do not necessarily have a real desire to learn. They sometimes accept being underpaid for fear of failing or not having money. Yet failure is part of success. People who avoid failure also avoid success. When something goes wrong, they prefer to denigrate their employer rather than question themselves. Whereas if they realize that they are the problem, they have the power to change. Unfortunately, ordinary people are only interested in stable work and increases. And when their boss gives them more money, they always want more and become in debt by taking credit. Employees become slaves to money. A slave even paid a fortune remains a slave. Finally, after this lesson, Robert continues to work for his rich dad without pay and even refuses a nice raise so as not to have to work for money. He finally manages to set up his first business with Mike by charging admission to a mini library of comics that he recovered for free from a store that was going to get rid of it. He managed to make the money work for him. Lesson 2. Why teach the ABCs of finance? It's not how much money you make, it's how much money you keep. The main idea of this chapter of Rich Dad, Poor Dad is that the gap between rich and poor has been supported for decades by an education system that does not teach us the basics of money and the world of finance. The goal of the school is to train you to be very good employees, not very good bosses or very good investors. We are taught to save but to put our money in an account when we can reinvest it so that it brings in more money. We may have done great studies, but we are almost all financially illiterate. If you doubt it, you can buy the Figaro. Try to read the Pink Supplement, and you will understand that you do not understand anything. It is only in business school that one learns a little economics or accounting, and still insufficiently. From an early age, we should learn how to manage our money. Finally, there should be more games like Monopoly or the Good Pay to teach children the basics. That's why Robert created the game Cash Flow. Robert reminds us in this chapter of the importance of financial education at any time of life. He also introduces here for me to the most important thing to remember from the book Rich Dad, Poor Dad, namely the difference between an asset or a liability, or the difference between an asset and a liability. An asset is a possession that generates income for its owner. A liability is a possession that will instead generate expenses. In English, it's even clearer. The term asset means asset, and liability means responsibility. I prefer the English terms because with passive it can be difficult to differentiate passive income, which is very good to have and can generate assets. The rich will invest more in assets, so that these assets become the bulk of their income. They have liabilities, the responsibility to pay credits and debts that bring them expenses, but they are covered by their income, which is more important thanks to their assets. Poor or middle-class people invest in liabilities that they think are assets. As an example, Robert takes that of a house. The purchase of a house often represents the investment of a lifetime, a major asset for an average person that we will be able to pass on to his children. But for Robert, a house is a liability that will represent many expenses and a credit that we will be prisoners of for 30 years. You're going to have to pay property tax and maintenance costs. Your home may lose value or be destroyed, and your children will still have to pay high estate fees if they want to inherit it. Sure, you don't throw rent out the window every month because you're paying off your credit, but you're not making money either. Rental investment is on the other hand an asset. The credit will be paid thanks to the rent of the tenants, and you can even make a capital gain each month, what Robert calls the cash flow. Like when you resell a product with a margin, or that you sell a stock on the stock market after making a product. The cash flow that we generate is the basis of the investment. The more cash flow you have, the more you can invest, and the richer you are. Lesson 3. Mind your own business. The rich focus on their assets columns while everyone else focuses on their income statements. Robert begins this chapter with a perfect anecdote when the creator of McDonald's asks students what his business is. His audience does not understand, and they all answer in heart, hamburgers. But no, the real business of McDonald's is that of real estate, because MC Donald's has established its all over the world its restaurants in strategic places. It is tending to be difficult to differentiate between business and occupation. When you're a banker, it's not your bank, it's someone else's. With this lesson, Rich Dad makes us understand that we must mainly worry about our business rather than working for the business of others. Every dollar earned must be reinvested intelligently. The rich buy luxury items last, while the poor and middle classes buy luxury items as soon as they receive the fruits of their first investments. So you have to work on your asset column to generate your income and reinvest it as much as possible while making sure not to pay too much tax on these assets. And starting a business avoids this problem. Lesson 4. The history of taxes and corporate power. The corporations are the biggest secrets of the rich. In this lesson on rich fathers and poor fathers, the author returns to the origins of government taxes and why they are so favorable to the rich. The most overtaxed class is the middle class. If a country taxes the rich too much, they will tend to find other solutions through companies, through perfectly legal tax schemes, or to move abroad. That, for example, is why the wealth tax disappeared in France. It is again for lack of financial education that finally, the middle classes pay full pot. Laws are made to facilitate investment by the rich, often through companies or holding companies. Personal investment is the most taxed. Companies have a more favorable regime. For example, when a company makes money, it first spends on employees and expense reports, and then pays its taxes on a lower income. So fewer taxes to pay. Conversely, an employee will receive his salary but will have to pay taxes before he can spend. So no more taxes to pay. Finally, by being employed, you work for money and you give power to your company that will make a profit. Whereas if the money works for us and the company you created, you keep the power. The lesson of the poor father is ultimately to pay first. Lesson 5. The rich beget money. Often in the real world, it's not the smart who get ahead, but the bold. We all know that money is the greatest universal belief. Ultimately, a note is just a piece of paper to which a fluctuating value is added. Money itself is not real, so it can be created. The rich create money and see opportunities where ordinary people see none. For example, Robert Kiyosaki recently did a webinar where he talks about all the investment opportunities represented by the health and economic crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic. As an example, Robert cites many real estate capital gains he made by buying real estate in such a crisis. He then resold them without difficulty, sometimes at triple the price once the market was restored. To do this kind of business, there is not necessarily a need for a financial contribution to buy. Again, you have to train in real estate as in any other market if you want to invest. If you don't understand investing, don't get started. It is often said that investing is risky, but Robert explains in his other book Guide to Investing that an investment is not a risk if it is measured and controlled. Lesson 6. Work to learn, not for money. Job security meant everything to my educated poor dad. Learning meant everything to my rich dad. In this last lesson, Robert Kiyosaki returns to the importance of training. He takes the example of a great writer he met while promoting his new book. She wondered why her book wasn't selling. He replied simply, "I'm not a best-writing author, I'm a best-selling author." In other words, it is not because he is a good author that he sells books, but because he knows how to sell them. To be able to build an empire and become rich, he emphasizes the importance of being a good salesman and knowing how to communicate. Unlike his rich dad, Robert was an introvert who hated selling. He eventually started working at Xerox because it had a very good business training program. The Big Mac is not known for being the best burger in the world, yet it is the best known. As Robert says, the world is full of talented but poor people. They need to be trained in sales and marketing to be successful. Robert advises young people to look for their first job not about what they will earn, but what they will learn. At the end of reading Rich Father Poor Father / Rich Dad Poor Dad, you will understand that wage labor ultimately offers no possibility of having financial freedom. It doesn't matter what your salary is. Robert recalls an old saying, "Job is an acronym for just over broke." This is what you will do through your business or with side money that will open the doors to freedom. So, ready to invest? Ready to start?